a packed agenda for today, so I'll go ahead and get us started. Welcome everybody to Dysfunctional DC, Insurance and Benefits Consequences of the Presidential Election. Coming from differing political perspectives, I have with me two familiar guests on our panel today, two nationally recognized insurance legislation experts and thought leaders, and really the two top big cheeses from our industry lobbying organization, the Council of Insurance Agents and Brokers, or CIAB. We have Joel Wood, President and CEO of CIAB, who in his current role and also his former role as top government affairs officer at CIAB has been deeply engaged in the many issues impacting the commercial insurance brokerage industry. From healthcare reform to terrorism reinsurance, Mr. Wood has been in the weeds and in the back rooms of Washington where the sausage is made, making sure that our industry is properly represented. And he's received numerous accolades as one of the top lobbyists in the financial services industry. And it's just a really great pleasure and honor to have you with us as always.
Oh, Dan, thank you for having me.
Yep,
Appreciate
of
it.
course. And of course, we have also with us today Joel Copperud, Senior Vice President, Government Affairs for CIAB. Mr. Copperud is also one of the leading lobbyists in our industry, where he has worked closely with Congress and our leaders in DC to ensure that our industry is well represented in a broad spectrum of complex issues, from employer-sponsored insurance and benefits to federal natural disaster catastrophe policies. I didn't think I could say that as fast as I did. Just a real thought leader in our industry as well. I just couldn't be more honored to have you with us as well. So thanks for joining us
Perfect.
today as well.
Thanks, Dan.
Um, Great. And my name is Dan Cooperstein, Senior Vice President of Compliance for Corporate Synergies, a Foundation Risk Partners company, or CSG for short, where I oversee our regulatory compliance consulting division. And prior to joining with CSG and the CIB 10 years ago, I was in private law practice in the ERISA and employee benefits practice at a national law firm, where I specialized in representing and defending employers and plan sponsors of all shapes and sizes and investigations of health and retirement plans. I love talking about the stuff, love speaking and writing about benefits and insurance. I've published over 50 articles in the field, and so I guess that just makes me a huge ERISA nerd, I guess. So, but I love it. So I guess that's okay, right? That's what I love talking about. So
You are our
today we're
number
here.
one ERISA nerd in America, Dan.
Exactly. Well, thank you for that. So, today we will explore how the outcome of the 2024 presidential election could reshape employer-sponsored employee benefits and insurance. Our expert panel, today we're going to be discussing the consequences to insurance and benefits programs from the election, including how potential policy and regulatory changes could impact plan sponsors' strategies for navigating this insurance landscape in the next term. We have, like I think we mentioned earlier, a real packed agenda today. Um, we're going to really talk about each candidate's policy views and the potential impact on different areas of benefits. We'll talk about the costs and taxation of benefits, the impact on the commercial insurance market, and then have some key takeaways, predictions, and closing remarks at the end. So, a lot to talk about. It's going to be a little bit of, I realize this is a lot, and we're going to try to keep pace in this marathon of topics and really just try to cover as much as we can. So, with that being said, let's jump in here. Um, so, the 2024 campaigns are now underway, and in the spotlight, we have former President Donald Trump, the Republican nominee, and Vice President Kamala Harris, the Democrat nominee, is the current viable contenders for the presidency. And I say current because, as you can see, I kind of pasted Kamala above Joe Biden, who is President Joe Biden. Just, as in case you've been in a different country for the last few months and haven't
Or
noticed, we have a
planet.
new candidate on the Democrat side. And just real quick before we jump into the meat of the presentation, I just wanted to give a quick disclaimer, which is that here at CSG, we do not take any one political side. We are completely agnostic when it comes to politics. And that's why my role here today is really mainly as a moderator, providing background info on the relevant topics. And as we've done in the past with the Joels, we're going to let Mr. Joel Wood discuss these issues from the Republican perspective, and Mr. Joel Copra discuss from the Democrat perspective. And one more quick disclaimer, just because I'm an attorney, I love disclaimers, which is that when preparing these slides, really our bullet points and our takeaways here are really based primarily on their records when they were in power. So for Trump, we're really looking at it from the perspective of his 4 years in power as president. For Ms. Harris, based primarily on what happened during the Biden-Harris administration. And that's kind of where we got a lot of the content for today. So okay, so let's jump in here. And I think the first topic I think that we wanted to talk about is healthcare and healthcare reform. Now, obviously, healthcare reform is not a central issue in this election as it has been in the past, but healthcare remains a significant concern for voters. And so we're going to start with that. And we'll talk about the ACA, reform of the ACA, and go on to discuss the potential impact of each candidate on healthcare and insurance coverage for health insurance, um, as well as their takes on prescription drugs and other topics in this area. So I think it goes without saying that, right, Trump and Harris have distinctly different records and positions on healthcare. Um, on the left, as you just to discuss these pictures on the slide, right on the left, as you may remember, John McCain with his thumb down. The is this picture kind of represents the fact that if you remember, Trump was not successful in his attempt to repeal and replace the ACA in 2017. And then on the right is a picture of Kamala Harris advocating for Medicare for all. So obviously a lot has changed there. I don't think she's going to be arguing for Medicare for all in this campaign. But let me let's take it from there, and I'll talk about some of the big things I think could likely happen on each side, and we'll let you guys weigh in. So after that, so Donald Trump, right? I think if you look at what he did in his administration, was the goal was really to try to make the ACA more employer friendly, and unfortunately, I think also probably less friendly for individuals and employees. But that's basically the short summary of it, right? I think he did things to make it like some of the things he did to make it more employer friendly were proposing the association health plan rules, introducing individual coverage HRAs or ICRAs, accepted benefit HRAs or EBRAs. He also reduced funding for ACA exchange outreach and enrollment assistance, shortened exchange open enrollment windows, and uh, well, he's made some comments to the effect of the fact that he would repeal and replace the ACA again, like he did in 2017. Um, given some of the ACA's popularity among senior Republicans, that I think remains unclear. One of the big accomplishments that he did have, as far as similar to the kind of repeal and replace movement, was that he was successful in reducing the individual mandate penalty to $0 as part of the TICJA, the tax reform legislation that he introduced. And then on the other side, with Kamala Harris, I think it's likely that she's going to try to maintain or even extend expanded eligibility for ACA premium tax credits or subsidies. And there was an expansion of that passed by the Biden-Harris administration under the ARPA and the Inflation Reduction Act. And that's going to go through 2025. I think it's also likely that she will try to maintain or extend the record high enrollment in ACA exchange plans that she was able to, the Biden-Harris administration was able to achieve, and just some other things that we'll kind of talk about kind of real quickly when we're talking about healthcare and healthcare reform more generally. I think on the Trump side, I think he is going to try to do things to lower prescription drug costs by making foreign importation of drugs easier. I think he could try to reintroduce a most favored nation system of international reference pricing for some Medicare covered drugs and or repropose Medicare Part D benefit design changes. He also could try to block ACA Medicaid expansion or propose a restructuring of Medicaid funding into a block grant, as well as limiting Medicaid eligibility in different ways, including work requirements as a condition of Medicaid eligibility. And I think on the Harris side, we saw a very different perspective. I think she's also going to probably try to lower prescription drug costs in a number of different ways. But I think probably doing things that continuing or expanding things that she worked on in the Biden-Harris administration, including drug price negotiations that were achieved in the Inflation Reduction Act, which, in case you saw and missed that news story recently, there's 10 prescription drugs now that will go through drug price negotiations. I think it's likely that she will maintain or expand fiscal incentives for states to adopt the ACA Medicaid expansion and will likely oppose measures or bills seeking to impose conditions like work requirements on Medicaid eligibility. So I know that was a lot to say in a very short period of time. But why don't we start with you, Joel Wood? Maybe you want to take the Republican
Yeah,
perspective on stuff.
that is a lot. And
Yeah.
actually, our organization is bipartisan, and when it comes to healthcare, I feel like we've got much to criticize, frankly, on both sides. Isn't it interesting that, it's been 15 years since those words of if you like your healthcare, you get to keep it, and we keep relitigating these same issues. Trump, you're correct. And by the way, congratulations on pronouncing the vice president's name correctly. Trump did has been saying uh, that a big and beautiful package is going to be unveiled any day now. We've been waiting about 7, 8 years for that now. That was the first big vote in the Trump administration, and it was a total disaster with McCain on the thumbs down. One thing you may have misstated because you said he voted to repeal and replace. It really was a repeal bill without anything of substance to replace.
Yep.
And
Sure.
and all that ever really got offered up in the way of incremental reforms, and they're fine by us, association health plans, buying across state borders, medical malpractice reform, all that's fine, but that is no comprehensive alternative to the ACA. So whatever you think about the ACA, there's about 25 million people that have gotten coverage under it, and it is, and even Trump is now saying, we're not going to repeal it outright. We're going to make it look snazzy. There's no depth there, and we can try to define that. It really depends on who the key, if he were to be elected, who the key players would be, and the what the Congress is going to look like at that point. With respect to the vice president, yes, she supported. She was the first co-sponsor of Bernie Sanders' Medicare for All. This was at a moment in which she was running. Everyone was trying to run leftward in the 2020 election. I tend to not give her the same pass that Joel Kay will give her on not being in support of Medicare for All. She has renounced support for that. I think you hit the nail on the big, big issues, which is the number one healthcare initiative that she would pursue. And we're going to have a crazy tax showdown next year and budgetary showdown very early in the season, irrespective of Congress and who controls the presidency, is that she wants to continue and potentially even expand those subsidies in the exchange, which to us continue to create a cost shift. At the end of the day, how much more can employers take? And our criticism, we'll get to it. Our criticism on the Republican side is that there is an element within the Republican Party that do not support the employer-provided group health insurance marketplace and would be willing to upend that through ending the tax exemptions for it. I also think you're hitting on the right big issue. I think we're down to only 10 or 11 states, Dan, you would know, that have not expanded Medicaid. I was told that it was, this being recorded, so I'm sure somebody could fact check me, but I think it took almost 17 years after the enactment of Medicaid, federal Medicaid subsidies, for all of the states to get in line on this. Ultimately, that's going to come. I think it's insanity, and I say this as a deep Southerner. It's an embarrassment of these states that have not gone ahead and accepted it, given the fact that 90% of the dollars have been coming from the federal side. So I think that that's going to be a major issue. And then you'll see all of these sort of incremental things if there is a Trump presidency. I think that the vice president, she's gonna go to great lengths here in the remaining 70 or what number of days before the election to clarify that she does not support blowing up the employer provided group health insurance marketplace. My bigger concern is just how sustainable is that marketplace given what we've, the double digit healthcare inflation.
Great. Thank you. But Joel K, you want to weigh in on how you see these issues unfolding?
Yeah, actually agree with most of everything that Joel said. I would just, I think it's interesting. I think a couple things that I would add to that. Ever since the ACA passed in 2008, rising healthcare costs has been the number one driver that got people to the polls. When you asked constituents across the country what their number one issue was, it was rising the cost of healthcare until 2016, when everything got flipped on its head, and all of a sudden, democracy and what was basic issues before all of a sudden catapulted to the top. And the economy is always up there. But I just share that to say that rising healthcare costs continues to be a top issue on the minds of voters. And so reining in the cost of prescription drugs, lowering costs for employers, all of that continues to be a top priority. This ACA extension, the subsidy issue next year, is kind of a double-edged sword for us. I say regularly, and I still like to say it because it's still relevant, that I think the death of the public option and the death of Medicare for all is one of the most underwritten stories in Washington, because it was in 2020, it was the number one issue on the campaign trail for all the presidential candidates when they were running for it was basically Bernie Sanders versus Joe Biden, and it was either completely eviscerate the market for private insurance or a public option. But once Biden was elected, poof, never was even debated in Congress. That's not by accident. That's a lot, impact the 180 million Americans that get their insurance from their employer, all that stuff. But what really took the wind out of the sails of that movement was when when Pelosi passed the American Rescue Plan, one of the four major spending bills over the pandemic that had these ACA subsidies in it. Rather than creating a federal insurance program, they just gave money to go to these 20 million uninsured Americans to go buy insurance on the exchanges. And that completely fizzled. So now we are in an environment where we have the lowest uninsured rate in American history because of those subsidies. And the commercial insurance, yeah, price shifting is a concern, but when the individual markets erode, the commercial markets pay the price also. So that it's just going to be a fascinating debate next year, because that's going to be on those ACA subsidies are going to be on the tail end of the major fiscal cliff issues that Joel touched on, which is the debt ceiling,
Definitely.
passing or reforming or reauthorizing the TCJA, which in and of itself is going to cost like upwards of $4 trillion. The economic issues they're going to have to deal with in the next Congress are so significant. And this ACA, the healthcare stuff, is going to be right there in the middle of it all. And we've got
100%.
a lot in it, but
Exactly.
yeah.
We started with ACA and healthcare reform generally and healthcare and all the big topics. But I think we would be remiss if we didn't touch on one of the most controversial, or I would say probably one of the hottest topics I would say in this election. I think you can't probably number two right under inflation and some of those issues that voters are concerned about is abortion, right? Abortion and reproductive health care. And I know we've talked about this in past. We did a webinar last year on this, so we'll try to go through this as quickly as we can.
Yeah, I
But
would just make just
yeah,
a quick political observation that
yeah,
yes, ever since the Dobbs decision, every election where this has been an issue, and it's going to be on the ballot in a number of state in a great number of states, including some of the really close states that are out there, the six or seven, where there's going to be separate ballot initiatives. If you ask people to rank, what do you care most about? You'll see, immigration, crime, inflation, the economy, reproductive rights. But if you go and it looks like it's one of five or six or seven major issues, but if you really look at the propensity of voters, people who identify that as their top issue are extremely high propensity voters. And so I think you will see hundreds of millions of dollars worth of ads on reproductive rights in this election. You will see zero ads spent by Republicans in defense of it. And so I do think that is, notwithstanding all the polls, and what we have been saying about the election 6 weeks ago as opposed to 4 weeks ago, as opposed to 2 weeks ago, who knows, and there are a million news cycles in these remaining 70, 71 days. But I think that notwithstanding how close it is in those key states and nationally, that is, a major factor down the stretch. And I think Republicans are well advised to understand that messaging is, well, I don't know that they can message their way out of this one. I just know that it's a critical factor right now.
Yeah, and
that's
I would
right.
add to that the pro-choice movement has put abortion on the ballot as a referendum in key swing states, in Arizona, in Nevada. It's going to be on the ballot. It's going to be on the ballot in states that matter to the Senate majority. It's going to be on the ballot in Montana, which is great for John Tester. So just underscoring everything that Joel just said, it's going to boost turnout for the progressives and should ultimately help Democrats, but we'll see.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I mean, I think that, yeah, like from what I've seen in a lot of these things that, in articles and just watching TV, my sense of it is very close to what you just said. I think abortion and reproductive health care is probably in the top five somewhere. And it seems like the Democrats are trying to make it much higher on that list because they think it's a winner for them, and Republicans are trying to make it lower on the list because it's not probably a winner for them. But I think just to kind of quickly, address those topics as quickly as I can. I think it's pretty clear now from what former President Trump is saying that he would leave abortion policy to the states. I think there were some other things he said that were different along the way. At one point, he said he was proud of his decision to elect the Supreme Court justices that would eliminate Roe v. Wade. And well, he said a lot of different things, right? But I think at the end of the day, right, it's Trump is going to probably leave that to if he wins, right, leave all of that stuff to the states as well as these other topics that are on here, and would likely oppose U.S. health funds, right, the federal government from performing, from promoting abortion, things like that. Then of course you have the opposite. I think there's no question that Kamala Harris would try to keep would try to, some kind of federal, law or something that would bring back the overturn Roe v. Wade ruling about, and likely support a federal law in that respect. And, really try to strengthen also HIPAA protections for reproductive healthcare privacy in her policies. Uh, Similarly, we saw with contraception and IVF, right? I think there's a very big gap there. We saw that case that come out, Alabama Supreme Court decision found that that treating frozen embryos as babies through the IVF process. I think that Kamala Harris would oppose that. Trump would probably say, let's leave it to the states, right? And then on one of the other big topics in the reproductive healthcare area is gender affirming care. Um, uh, I think again, I think on the Trump side, we'll likely would see him opposing that or leaving it up to the states. If you recall, during his administration, he issued revised ACA Section 1557 rules that removed protections in healthcare based on gender identity and sexual orientation, and has said he would prohibit gender affirming care for minors. And then, of course, the opposite on the Harris side. I think she's tried to protect or expand protections um, for gender affirming care and LGBTQ health more generally. And I think those are pretty much I mean, that's pretty much a quick summary there. I think of kind of how they look at things from both sides, but ultimately, right, the president's power to pick Supreme Court justices is, I think, one of the big things here that's going to be a hot button issue in this election. So I hope I hit all the big points there, but I don't know. Is there anything else you guys want to add on
No,
reproductive health care?
I would just add, look, it is a 6-3 Supreme Court, and so Dobbs isn't going to be overturned in a 6-3 conservative majority. And however, if you squint your eyes, I mean, I can envision, just because so many crazy things have happened in the last 2 months, I can envision Democratic trifecta where they win both the control of both chambers and the presidency. And I guess I could theoretically squint my eyes and see the opposite on the Republican side. But in that event of a Democratic trifecta, and you would have a Democratic control of the Senate with a 51 margin that does not have Kyrsten Sinema or Joe Manchin, who were the two who stood in the way of filibuster reform. And so when you look at the public option, you look at issues like even expanding the Supreme Court. FDR tried to pack the Supreme Court. The country did expand the Supreme Court back in the 1860s or something like that, based on an expanding population. You'd have to imagine the filibuster being overturned. It's not unimaginable, it is unlikely. And that would be, if you get rid of the filibuster, that's when a whole lot of issues that could not prevail in the Biden administration, like DC statehood, for example, or the public option, that could not fit into a reconciliation bill, like the deficit, like the COVID bill, like the infrastructure bill, like the Inflation Reduction Act. That's when you can start imagining a lot more policy initiatives that are not dependent upon the federal fisc of spending and taxation. But again, I think the chances of that sort of depends on how you see the election playing out. If the big momentum stays on with Vice President Harris and they sweep, but there's probably a higher likelihood that we have some degree of divided government, just because the Senate map is very favorable to Republicans, and they only need a couple of seats to change that equation.
It's also worth
Absolutely.
remembering that no matter, even if it is a trifecta, I think I agree with Joel. I think it's most likely that we're going to have divided government and probably Republican control of the Senate. But if he's right, if you do squint and it's a trifecta for either side,
Yeah.
it's not going to be a landslide. The margins are going to be, you can probably count on one hand what the majority is going to be in the House and the Senate. So if it is a Republican trifecta, I think you're going to see people like senators like Lisa Murkowski, like Susan Collins, play the role of Kirsten Sinema and Joe Manchin in terms of reining in the Trump agenda. On the flip side, I think we'll see it on. I mean, you're gonna have to get AOC on the same page as the most moderate Democrats to get anything through the House because they're going to have only a 4 to 5 seat majority, we think, if they win back the House. And that's very similar to what Republicans are dealing with now, getting the wings on the same page. So even if it is a landslide, if it's a trifecta and one party controls everything, they're still really going to have to work to thread the needle on getting anything accomplished because in this environment, as you guys can see, the wings on both parties are so extreme. They're out there, but leadership is going to need their votes just as much as they need those moderate votes. So it's hard to anything extreme getting through. We'll see that reconciliation bill happen that Joel would talked about if there's a single party control. But I think even that will be um, not dramatic. We won't be seeing stacking of the Supreme Court and filibuster repeal and all that stuff. I don't think.
Okay.
I'm I'm very disappointed in myself that I'm just agreeing with you so much here, Joel. We need to.
Exactly. Yeah, this is interesting. You guys are, I think, agreeing much more than in past presentations we've done together. Um, so I wanted to bring in the topic of healthcare transparency, even though I know it's not one of the top, political contentious points but mainly because it's so important to our clients, right? As I speak to our clients from across the country, this has just become such a big burden on what they have to do, right? The HR and the benefits managers at our clients are just overwhelmed with whether it's the CAA prescription drug reporting or it's other transparency requirements and rules. And the interesting thing about this, right, is that in many ways, right, a lot of these new rules in this area of healthcare transparency came out under the Trump administration, I think, which has tried to try to say that they do things to make it easier for employers, right? And if you recall back on June 27th of 2019, President Trump signed an executive order trying to make it easier for there to be more healthcare transparency, basically. So it's easier for individuals to be able to shop around and buy, know what they're buying essentially on their health plan. And then, of course, that law that was signed into law as a result, in many ways, of the big push by the Trump administration was the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2021, the CAA of 2021, and the CAA really kind of created all of these different requirements you see on the slide. We don't have time to go through all of them, right? There's the gag clause, attestation requirement. There's broker consultant fee disclosure, which requires that the clients designate a responsible plan fiduciary to oversee that and ensure that service providers are not overcharging and only charging reasonable compensation. So a lot of this stuff came out of came out of the CAA that was part of the Trump administration, but of course has evolved into this very complicated, big, world of new regulations. And as a part of this, we're also seeing some increased litigation in the area of fiduciary responsibility, right, as that came out of the CAA's broker consultant fee disclosure rules. And in the cases of, for example, Lewandowski versus Johnson and Johnson and Navarro versus Wells Fargo, really where plan participants took issue with how much PBMs were charging and the cost of prescription drugs on the plans. And of course, most recently, a month ago, Mark Cuban on X, July 22nd, came out saying, issued this big warning to self-insured employers saying if your company receives pharmacy rebates through your employee benefits program, prepare for an eventual lawsuit. And it's not a question of if, it's a question of when, right? So there's this big, a lot of our clients are really kind of feeling this, especially our self-insured, our clients that sponsor self-insured plans. And it's just kind of unclear as to how this is all going to play out. And my quick take, at least on it, is as far as what I think may likely happen is that I think I think that Trump will likely continue to enforce the CAA 2021. I mean, it was his legislation, right? But I do think he will likely try to reduce some of those more burdensome regulations and guidance that was promulgated under it. And I think that under the Harris administration, we probably would see a sort of steady, keeping the course, right? Following what happened in the Biden administration, upholding those regulations. I think it might look I think if Trump wins, it might look a lot more like what we saw with all of the ACA regulation, right? If you recall when Trump took office, after the Obama administration, he, didn't finalize certain regulations like the opt-out incentive rules. Certain rules were just, rescinded. And I think at least maybe I'm being overly optimistic, at least for our clients that are overwhelmed with this stuff. But I think that we would probably see that. I think if there's a Trump victory, and it's unclear how the Harris administration would go about it, but I think that they would likely also, like the Trump administration, continue to enforce the CAA, but also keep a lot of those regulations in place. So
I agree, Dan, and I would note, yes, it was signed, and the CAA was signed into law under Trump's presidency, but that was the requirements for transparency that were designed for the entirety of the healthcare ecosystem were quite bipartisan. This was then Senator Lamar Alexander and Senator Patty Murray, who were the principal architects of that. We cooperated. They were adding new broker compensation requirements, and it's kind of tough for brokerages to be able to identify prospectively on that Form 5500 what your compensation is going to be. But we work with Congress on this. We did not oppose it. We work with the Labor Department and with our members to try to come up with best practices. So far, so good. The problem is that the PBMs have said that they don't believe that those transparency measures were intended for them as well. And yes, with the J&J lawsuit and now the Wells Fargo lawsuit, you as an ERISA attorney have been seeing for your entire professional career all kinds of challenges in the retirement 401k space. This is a new area, and
exactly.
it's a perverse outcome of these transparency provisions that you're seeing these lawsuits that are coming up alleging that PBMs are paying higher prices for generic drugs that are available in the marketplace. It's significantly less. And I think employers have to, I know you have counsel for your employer clients, but everyone has to be watching very carefully what their plan looks like, because I think Mark Cuban's right. There's tremendous vulnerability, and I think you're going to see all kinds of opportunistic legal actions aimed at plans. And this is opening up sort of a new world of litigation that we hadn't seen before.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think it may look a lot like early days of the 401k litigation, about 10, 15 years ago, where, it just really, when we created they're basically amendments to Section 408(b)(2) of ERISA. It just created a lot of litigation. I think I think we're still at the very beginning stages of that, but I can see that happening, I think, regardless of which candidate wins. But Joel K., what are your thoughts on this topic?
I actually completely agree with Joel and what you guys are talking about. I think the one thing that's interesting is that the biggest beneficiaries of the political toxicity right now is the PBM industry as a whole. I mean, we have been successful at the major healthcare legislation getting through this Congress. If anything can get through this Congress, everyone has said from the left and the right in the House and the Senate that 80% of each chamber supports transparency for PBMs and enforcing those transparency requirements. They can't get it done. And the reason they can't get it done is because the PBM industry has lined themselves up with a handful of members of Congress that are intentionally hijacking the entire process. And those members of Congress are saying that this legislation is anti-market, it's anti-competitive, it's anti all these things. And so they're holding it up. So it's just one of those frustrating issues where it's us against the process. And I'm actually a big believer that the process works. Obviously, I'm a big believer in advocacy and all of that, but this is one of those things where small minorities keeping things that clearly the majority of American people want this to get done.
Yeah, just the way that James Madison established our government. It's always much easier to beat something than it is to pass something, and that's what the PBMs have going for them because there are very large bipartisan majorities in both the House and in the Senate that do support legislation, and the House has passed legislation that would, essentially, it's more complicated than this, but would apply the same provisions that apply to your firm, Dan, with respect to prospective reporting requirements to the PBMs, which are dominated by the big three. Now, in fairness, our offices are right next door to Cigna's offices, and I had a spirited conversation with their lobbyists last week, and their belief is their opposition is to the spread pricing model, which would be doomed in the House passed legislation, as opposed to just pure transparency on where the dollars are going. But just the way that those costs bounce around in the system. I have a son who has Duchenne muscular dystrophy, and it's a terrible disease. And we got our first gene therapy drug in the marketplace this past year, approved for only 4 to 7 year olds with limited efficacy. And my son is 27 now; he's not eligible for it, but limited efficacy, one shot, $3.2 million, and for a small, self-insured plan with just a little stop loss. I mean, this is the cost of specialty drugs and the way these numbers bounce around in the system. I can argue it either way. Having a son with a rare, dramatic, catastrophic disorder, as to the necessity for employers to be able to pick up the tab on this, but also know that employers are at sort of the breaking point, and we are on the edge of all kinds of new genetic therapies that are coming to the marketplace, all of which are coming in at six, if not seven figures.
Yeah, crazy, crazy prices. And I think that's a great segue for our next couple of topics here, which are retirement and financial benefits, like, well, student loans, educational assistance plans, things like that. When it comes to, you know, this is kind of a little bit of, we're talking about that, and we're also going to talk about costs in the next section here. But I think to kind of round off to finish off our benefits discussion, um, I actually don't think there's going to be that much difference in the retirement plan space so much, like when it comes to things like 401ks, the Secure Act, right? We saw both administrations support things that would make 401ks more accessible and easier to obtain. If you look at the Trump administration side, there were also things that were done with regard to other benefits like 529 plans to make them more flexible, to allow them to be used for private schools prior to college, and other things that made benefits more flexible in the TICHA, the tax reform law. On the Harris side, they working as part of the Biden administration, right? They signed the Secure 2.0 Act that even further expanded the flexibilities of 401ks. And of course, as I'm sure you've seen in the news, there's been a lot of discussion about will a Harris administration continue to fight against those student loan payments. And I think it's been kind of one of those things that's been it's unclear. But I'd love to get your thoughts on how they would go about these other types of benefits.
You tell me how long this is all going to be litigated through because of all this, the challenges and where the Supreme Court is going to land on that. I don't have any other insight beyond that. I do know that in the retirement space, my understanding, again, I'm the CEO of the trade association, not down in the weeds on this stuff, but my understanding is that there has been an uptick in 401 litigation this year. And most of the lawsuits are arguing that either the fiduciary dependents failed to control the record keeping costs, failed to defray reasonable expenses of administering plans, misusing 401k forfeitures, and didn't make sound plan investments. So a lot of that, and it can completely irrespective of the political environment. I don't see major implications in the retirement space because you have on the one hand the benefits professional class in DC that found receptive audiences with the Trump administration. And likewise, I think you've got an entrenched, and I don't say that in a negative way, bureaucracy at HHS, CMS, and labor, who also want to promote retirement savings and have the legal framework that is existing. As you know, it's just really, these are tricky, knotty issues. It took a decade of work to get to Secure Point 1.0, and almost another decade worth of work to get to Secure 2.0. Nobody's talking about a 3.0. They're talking about things along the edges of it. And I think all the other core fiscal issues associated with the debt, with the expiration of the TCJA, uh, with a wide variety of other issues are going to dominate, and
Yeah,
there may be some things down the weeds of a comprehensive legislation next year that would impact their retirement plans.
I agree with that as well. Joel K, anything you want to add on retirement and other types
Only
of
thing I would add
mandatory?
is that there's a retirement savings crisis in this country, which continues to
Yeah,
fuel all the efforts to encourage Americans to use all more vehicles and more creative vehicles to save tax-free. And I think we'll continue to see that effort move forward for many years because I don't think that solving the retirement savings crisis is around the corner anytime soon.
agreed 100%. And that's a great segue, of course, to, you guys have been touching on this throughout the presentation today. So I think it's probably one of the top issues out there, which is, of course, health, inflation and inflation generally, right? I think that it's, we always say it's the economy stupid, right? When it comes to election time, because it seems to always almost come in as one of the big things when people are unhappy about how their wages have grown or not grown in light of inflation, then it oftentimes predicts that the candidate that's opposed or the party that's not currently in power might win. I don't know if that's always the case, but I think it's certainly always one of the top topics. And so I wanted just to kind of briefly touch on some of the things, some of the factors that companies say are driving their healthcare costs. And this is thank you to you guys actually for providing this helpful slide, which I think is terrific, in a survey of 118 employer members of Business Group on Health, conducted in June and July of 2024. These are the factors that were said to be driving the cost to a great or very great extent, right? And GLP-1s is really at the top of that list, right? These are the weight loss medications from Eli Lilly and some of these other large pharmaceutical companies that are so popular right now and really, in many ways, kind of essentially like almost curing obesity. And with the other interesting thing about this is that really the indications for the GLP-1 seem to be expanding too. It's with AI, and AI is kind of in many ways finding new indications, new avenues for a lot of these medications, and also the high cost therapies that Joel talked about earlier, right? Some of these costs are astronomical, right? Hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars. And it's those things are really kind of just really driving a lot of the costs. And then, of course, another big hot topic that's not on the slide, but I think rather than us go through the rest of these things here, I think one of the big hot topics that I know you guys are both talking quite a bit about lately is the TICJA continuation, right? The continuation of a lot of those tax reform provisions that were introduced during the Trump administration that will be sunsetting, right? So maybe Joel W., you want to get us started on this one and give us some
Yeah.
more things as to how they're breaking out?
Top of mind for me is that I'm getting blood work done in the morning, and my physical is next Wednesday. And if my A1C is elevated, then I'm going to ask the doc to prescribe me one of those, whether it's Ozempic or Wegovy or Manjaro or whatever the new one is that they're saying is so hot. And I
Zepbound, maybe? Zepbound?
that's it. That's it.
Yep.
And apparently there's quite a shortage of that.
Yep.
It's a major factor for employers right now,
Yep.
and that's reflected in the numbers here. I would and then just beyond that, and everything associated with the high cost therapies. We've been blessed that particularly since COVID, that employers in a tight labor market need to feel a profound uh, need to provide good benefits to attract and retain employees. Um, if that labor market changes, and if the cost structure continues to raise, I am concerned about that long-term commitment. I do think that there are some things that the Trump administration, if there were a second one, might do to erode employer need for offering these products. But that's just my long-term worry is the employers themselves, who, particularly as we see, they can be good options like the ICRAs, but the whole option of basically planting money, giving employees a set amount of money and sending them off to the exchanges, and what would the spiral of that potentially look like? Um, I don't have a crystal ball on this. I just worry about the long-term challenges. And whatever you think about the ACA, as I said, 25 million people have coverage now that didn't have it before. And but it's almost like the ACA's enactment, it's almost like a false summit. And from here, the grade only gets more steep in that the bending of the healthcare cost curve. One political adage is true of both parties. Everybody wants to go to heaven and nobody wants to die. From an access standpoint,
Sure.
the ACA has provided much more access. And the employer provided system remains strong, and 174 million Americans receive their health insurance for their employer. But when it comes to the costs associated with obesity, with chronic illness, with end of life issues, with overutilization of specialists, with self referrals to specialists, the cost of specialty drugs and pharma drugs in general. These are really difficult things, and I don't think see a lot of profiles and courage on the Republican or the Democratic side to be able to take these things on, because the choices are very true. And so I just worry that, I hope that it doesn't take some uh, stupendous change in the nature of the labor markets that could undermine ESI, because we still have a system that is very reliant upon it.
And Joel, do you see as one of the things that, the Harris campaign came out and talked about price gouging and how they may put limitations on grocery stores? Are you in the camp of, that may be like a slippery slope or may lead to much more price controls? Is that, do you see that happening, or do you think that that's not likely to happen in
Well,
this
yeah,
case?
I mean, I'm old enough to remember, anything, all Republicans are critical of anything in the price control arena. We see, on the Medicare drug pricing, for example, we got the 10, that was a result of the Biden administration's success in the Inflation Reduction Act. It's the first time Big Pharma was ever defeated on a big political thing. It's 10 drugs, but they're very expensive drugs. That being said, my colleague from Cigna just argued that, they were already negotiating out for their PBMs lower prices than what are emerging from those Medicare prices, and that it's all sort of a Trojan horse. And and clearly in a Harris administration, they would want to move that number beyond 10 as far as they can go. But it's sort of like, everybody wants insulin to be $35 a month. But there's a lot of chronic illnesses with extremely high price specialty drugs. Why
And
there? And so I think it skews economically, and I would argue in opposition to them. But I think in any event, we're going to see incrementalism.
yeah, yeah, that makes sense. Joel K, what are your thoughts on these topics?
Wholeheartedly agree with that last statement. I think that once we see Medicare start to negotiating the costs of these expensive drugs, and we see those costs come down, I think you're going to see that be very popular. And I think we will start to see more and more we will move incrementally towards more price controls. We're going to see, I mean, with Kamala Harris making these statements about price gouging, I'm seeing on my Instagram some members of Congress starting to post some of their own investigations in their districts. And I can say Richie Torres did an investigation on how his district is being charged 100% more than the district next to him for water, from the water company. So, or energy, I don't know, one of the critical infrastructure services. But you're gonna see this movement of starting to investigate, is price gouging actually happening, and that will come with some political backlash, no doubt. But if 100% difference is common, I think we're going to see probably a more active FTC, which is going to put the business community on their heels. I mean, clearly this train's going until we find a balance. But
I,
yeah.
I did see the quick little comment that popped up from Deborah for just a nanosecond about that 25 million extra that are covered are part of what is contributing to. I do not disagree. I completely agree with that. I just think that it's a Gordian knot on all of this. And the other comment about, I'm clearly not agnostic. You're right. I do care. I'm just trying to be fair here. So, but I
Yeah.
appreciated both those comments.
Yeah, those are good. And I can just say personally, like my parents were in the grocery business, and I remember how outraged they were before. I mean, they're retired, but I remember how outraged they were when, under the Obama administration, they had to put those little stickers on the fruit that said the country of origin labels, right? And I think that this thing probably, if they were still in the business, I think some of these comments would have been very scary to them. But look, it's hard to tell how just because she made some comments about grocery store price gouging, it's hard to tell how that may impact other things like healthcare and health insurance and insurance costs. But yeah, that's something I think that a lot of folks are watching very closely. And what about TICJA continuation? I mean, where do you? I know you guys have been
So if nothing
fighting about a
happens,
lot of this a lot
yeah,
lately. So
if
yeah,
nothing happens, about half of the provision of the TCJA do expire at the end of 2025. I am sure that on this call that there are a number of firms that are organized as pass-through enterprises. Not all pass-through enterprises, but a great many of them, particularly if they're involved on the manufacturing front. Got a special 20% tax rate under that law that will absolutely expire at the end of next year. And then pass-through rates would then just be reflective of what the highest personal rate. Kamala proposes a 39.4 or 6% highest personal rate that could factor into all of that. Meanwhile, the corporate tax decrease to 21% under the TCJA theoretically continues on, but almost everyone agrees. I mean, they're with the expiration, that's going to be on the table.
yeah,
Even if you were to see the Republicans running the table, that's going to uptick some. If you see Democrats running the table, it's going to uptick to 28%, which is what Vice President Harris is proposing. So a lot of factors involved in that. And as Joel said, on January 1, the debt ceiling is set to expire. Hopefully, they will deal with that in the lame duck session of Congress. We
yeah.
currently are essentially operating off of continuing resolutions now. The Senate has passed 17 of 19 appropriations bills out of committee, not a one that has been able to make it through the entire Senate. So we're going to have another showdown on
Yeah.
and what kind of policy riders are going to be associated with that. I just have never seen anything shaping up to be as tumultuous as the first and second quarter of next year politically of the political outcome in the elections.
I think that's great. That's great closing remarks. And I think yeah, Joel, I know you already kind of spoke on this. So anything else you wanted to add on the TICJA?
No, for the sake of time, I continue to agree with Joel, which I know is to the surprise of everybody, but just
We're
speaks to the
both
crazy dynamics we're living in these days.
Exactly. And that leads us to our last topic. I know we still have a little over 5 minutes here. So we wanted to kind of just touch on the hard commercial insurance market, right? This is an image of Hurricane Debbie, and it hit the Southeast really bad. And the cost of flood insurance it's just unobtainable for many. And so
So,
I just wanted to get you guys'
so
thoughts on
we
that.
had in the commercial property casualty arena, we had 14 years essentially of a soft marketplace. It's interesting the hardness and the softness of the commercial property casualty marketplace doesn't really correlate that well to the economy itself going up and down. Now, yes, one of the major contributors to the hard market in recent years has just been core inflation, supply chain issues, the cost of replacement goods and roofs and et cetera. We have been in the meantime, we are now in the seventh year, the 27th consecutive quarter of a hard market of quarter after quarter of aggregating everything in the commercial property casualty space and it getting more. Now, Q2 was the first quarter in which we're starting to see that. I wouldn't use the word softening, but not hardening as much. Um, what are the political consequences of that? They tend to be state by state. And so the coastal states are having raging issues on these issues. Obviously, litigation reform, lawsuit abuse is out there. You've seen big debates in Florida. 78% of all of the costs of the claims in America, of the litigation costs in America for all of homeowners were inside the state of Florida alone last year. And then you see in California where the personal lines marketplace for most homeowners has essentially gone away. And you've now got the FAIR plan, which is the residual market plan similar to Citizens in Florida. And you've got brokers frantically trying to place coverage around the edges of that. Something's got to give. These are all the climate related issues. We can't solve that in the remaining 5 or 10 minutes of this call. But something ultimately has got to give, whether it's third party litigation, funding, whether it's nuclear verdicts, just legal reform. These are really difficult issues, and they tend to be on a state by state basis. Are we seeing legislation that might impact it? So with
That's
that,
helpful. Thanks.
key
Thank you. Yeah.
takeaways.
But we're just, I wanted to briefly, I know we only have a couple minutes here, so I want to give each of you a minute to kind of give your closing remarks. This is just an image of someone who went around delivering turkeys during the pandemic. And I noticed it hasn't been a topic of, people have been talking about very much, but neither party, I think, is really talking about the pandemic, right? I think maybe because they want to maybe just stay positive and have a positive message. But I think I'd love to get your thoughts on that. I know we're kind of running out of time. So what I'd like to do here quickly is just have some of my own quick closing remarks. And I know I've heard this sentiment from a lot of our clients across the country, which is that I just wish it wasn't so polarized, right? I wish we could go back to a simpler time when Republicans and Democrats got along better and actually got more done for our country, including making benefits and insurance easier for companies and employees, which seems like maybe it doesn't have the level of priority that it used to have. And so those are some of my thoughts on this. And this is actually a slide you guys have. You guys had one of your decks from probably around 10 years ago, but I just think it's great because, right, it wasn't really that long ago, right, that the Trump went to a wedding with the Clintons. He was hugged and kissed by the Clintons. He was on I think, an episode of The View where he was being hugged and kissed and by everybody. And right, we were so far away from those times now, right? So I
I,
would
I
love
will.
to get your
I
thoughts
will.
on that.
I
So
will try to. Yeah. If I hadn't seen that picture a decade ago, I would have thought it was generated by AI. The
exactly.
I would just end on a little bit of an upbeat note. In that I think Joel would agree. Um, we, for example, have the largest political action committee in the insurance industry, and we give evenly between Republicans and Democrats, and they span the ideological perspective divide because most of our issues tend to not be Republican versus Democrat or conservative versus liberal. That being said, I'd say 65, close to two-thirds of members in both sides of the aisle are pretty normal and want to do the right thing. And
Yeah,
it's, as Joel said, it's the extremes that are pulling us out. And each party having to, and it's the social media environment and the fact that whether it's Marjorie Taylor Greene and Matt Gaetz and Lauren Boebert on the right, or it's AOC and Pramila Jayapal and Elon Omar, on the left that are tweeting out, the more mean spirited it can get, the more money you can raise, the more you can magnify your profile, the more you can control the dialogue in your parties. But most of them still want to do the right thing.
yeah,
And I'd like to think that, we can envision a future where we get back to some level of normalcy.
that's great. I appreciate that. Joel K, last thoughts, closing remarks here. We've got about a minute left here. And I just want
Yeah,
to
I
say this.
agree.
I just think that Kamala Harris is going to be a real contender. She's tough. And I just that's why this picture is in there with her with the police officers, because I think you can't count
Yeah,
her
no.
out.
Look, I mean, 3 weeks ago, a month ago, we were planning on Republican trifecta, talking about what's going to be in the reconciliation bill. They were going to tax health insurance. They were going to extend TCAJ 100%. wow, have things changed. And to your point about going back to normal, I mean, it was a vast majority of Americans that didn't want to have that re-election of two candidates that neither one wanted, and who are they going to hold their nose on? And it was all about persuading the double haters. They were the key target audience for both campaigns, was double haters in these swing states. That's not the case anymore. These are not double hated candidates anymore. So I think that there's light at the end of the tunnel here. I'm not saying that I think Harris is going to win. And I think she's going to, and I think it's going to be Republicans are going to take back Congress in 2 years, and Harris is going to lose 4 years. But I think that this might be the beginning of maybe some stability coming back. You're seeing the far left continue to lose elections. We just saw Cori Bush lose an election to a moderate Democrat. We did the same thing with Jamal Bowman, an extreme socialist, lost to a moderate Democrat. So you're seeing this side being muted, and I think we're about to see the other side be muted. And maybe we can come back. The question for me is, if Donald Trump loses, what happens to the MAGA movement? Does someone take the reins? Do they have the person? Is it going to be an Elon Musk kind of character? Or is it going to dissipate and we're going to come back to some kind of normalcy, what we used to be at? I think this, if Harris does win, you're going to see her trend towards the political center. I know I'm close with a lot of her senior staffers. They come from the New Dem on Capitol Hill. Will that philosophy see its way through? We saw Biden have to run to the left to appease the socialists. It looks like Harris is moving to the center to do the opposite, to secure moderate policies to go through a Congress that's going to be pretty divided or narrowly divided. So I don't know. I was pretty grim on things a couple months ago, but I'm starting to see light at the end of the tunnel. And I'm not, if you knew me, if you've been near me within the past 7 years and asked me what I thought about Kamala Harris, I probably would not have had very many positive things to say about her. But I'm not anymore. I think it's more about what you just talked about, Dan, about getting back to some political stability and where we can actually get along and talk to each other like Americans, like we know we are.
Man, it kills me to let you have the last word here, Joel.
Yeah.
And
That was really
thank you.
impressive. I was very impressed. That was awesome.
You guys are all extremely well represented by Dan and Corporate Synergies, and I've welcomed this opportunity.
Well, thank you. And I'm just always so honored to have you guys join us for these. These are always a lot of fun. So thank you so much for joining us today. And we're out of time, but let's keep the conversation going. This is really terrific. Thank you.
Perfect.
Thank you,
Thanks, Dan.
Great. Thanks. Great. Bye.